Hi, I want to talk to you today about a wonderful, witty novel called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. It was published in the early 60s, but the action of the book takes place in the 1930s. And the story is basically about a school teacher, Miss Jean Brodie, who, in cultivating a group of her favorite girl students, creates a little almost mini fascist movement within the school. Now, eventually, Ms. Brodie is denounced for exactly that sort of proto-fascist cult of personality by one of the characters in the book by the name of Sandy Stranger, who, as her name implies, is kind of an outsider that Miss Jean Brodie never quite trusts, and who ends up actually herself going into a nunnery by the end of the book, as if in penitence for having betrayed Miss Jean Brodie, who was still a formative influence on her life. The book is very funny in a dry British kind of way. But there are deeper themes in it that go beyond just the topical mention of fascism and so forth in the 1930s. Behind the book and its plot is the problem of Calvinistic determinism. In other words, the idea that people are essentially destined, either for salvation or for damnation. And this is the concept, in a way, that Miss Jean Brodie projects onto her students. She views one of them, by the name of Rose Stanley, as destined, to be known for sex, or famous for sex, in the words of the novel. In other words, Rose is going to have an affair with a much older man that will become sort of notorious. But Rose herself is completely uninterested in sex, as we meet her in the book as a young girl. But Miss Jean Brodie just has this idea of who her students really are that becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another one of the girls, named Mary, is clumsy and kind of dull, and Miss Brodie harps on this aspect of her character endlessly. And of course, Mary does end up dying prematurely in a fire, in part because of her just bad luck and clumsiness. Now, the book is also very interesting for its portrayal of gender dynamics. It portrays pretty much all the men in the book as deeply wounded or flawed in some basic way as a result of the First World War. And this is a pretty common theme in books of the 30s, that European masculinity was in bad shape. One of the characters in the book is missing his arm. Miss Jean Brodie's old flame, named Carruthers, actually died in World War One, and none of the surviving men are really worthy of Miss Jean Brodie's attention, at least in her own eyes. She does have an affair with one of her fellow teachers at the school, and she also kind of entertains flirtations with some of the other men, but they all have some kind of flaw, or one kind or another. One is too short, one's missing his arm, and so forth. But Miss Jean Brodie manages to kind of weave a web of power and influence within the school, in part by flirting with all the male teachers, and then exerting this influence over her select few students that she has cultivated. Now, one of the other themes in the book that's really interesting, it has a lot in common with other books by female authors, Jane Eyre, for instance, is the role of food as a substitute for sexuality. And this is a very obvious kind of motif that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and Eve being tempted and eating the apple. And that is some, in a misogynistic narrative, of course, it's like female curiosity or female attractiveness or whatever is the root of all evil and sin in the world. But so these female writers like Spark and Bronte, when they want to talk about women's sexual appetites or their curiosity, they put it in terms of food. Because really, when we meet the girls in the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, they are too young to have any serious sexual experiences. However, Miss Jean Brodie is very intent on teaching them the facts about sexuality. But whenever the issue comes up in conversation amongst the girls, they end up giving each other like toffee or something to kind of distract themselves from the burden of too much sexual knowledge or experience at too young an age. Miss Jean Brodie also uses food in a way to kind of control one of the men in the book with whom she is not having an affair. She's intent on feeding this man up almost against his will with all kinds of food and so forth, as a way again to exert power over him. So I like to say, when you're reading a book where there's a lot of sexual undercurrent, watch what the female characters are eating and how they treat food, because that will tell you an awful lot about what their desires are, and how those desires are getting processed or sublimated. Thanks for listening.